Honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Langley-Aldergrove for his good work. He and I served on City Council together in Abbotsford. He knows budgets, and I'm so pleased that he pointed out the gaping holes in the Liberals' 2017 budget. As the Member of Parliament for Abbotsford, I've made it my priority to bring the concerns of my constituents to Ottawa and to hold this Liberal government accountable for its actions. Since the election of the Liberal government in 2015, our Conservative caucus has fought hard to maintain balanced budgets, avoid deficits, lower taxes on Canadians, and support our small businesses. These are the bedrocks of a strong and growing economy. Sadly, the recent budget does none of these things. In fact, the Liberals have thoroughly disappointed Canadians by littering their path with reckless spending and broken promise after broken promise. For the second year in a row, the Liberals have blown past their pledge to limit the deficit to $10 billion per year, running huge deficits of $30 billion and driving our country further and further into debt. Shame. And who has to repay that debt, Mr. Speaker? It's our children and our grandchildren. That's who. Effectively, what we're doing is spending recklessly on ourselves today and letting future generations pick up the tab. As for balanced budgets, good luck with that promise. Remember the Prime Minister promising to balance the budget by 2019? Well, now the Department of Finance predicts that we won't see balanced budgets until, wait for it, the year 2055. For 40 years, no balanced budgets. That is a disgraceful performance. Let's not forget that our Conservative government under Stephen Harper left the Liberals with a balanced budget in 2015, having carefully shepherded Canada's economy through the worst global economic recession since the Great Depression. Which leads me to the obvious question: how can the Liberal government afford all this spending? The answer is higher taxes, of course. That is, after all, what tax and spend Liberals do. And they've also completely abandoned our small businesses, who are the key drivers of our economy and create the majority of jobs in Canada. Budget 2017 does absolutely nothing to help those businesses. In fact, the Liberal budget mentions small business only 6 times. Now let's contrast that with the last Conservative budget, in which small businesses were mentioned almost 200 times, and in which we laid out concrete steps the government would take to support their growth and their success, including lowering the small business tax rate to 9%. So it's surprising, Mr. Speaker, just how quickly this Liberal government has made a mess of our tax system and the supports that we implemented for small businesses. Now, just this week, in fact, I met with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, which is still demanding that the Liberals make good on their promise to cut the small tax rate to 9%. With new payroll taxes on the horizon, CPP taxes on the horizon, small businesses are worried that many of the policies implemented by our former Conservative government will be reversed. So why is this significant? Well, Canadian businesses don't just compete locally. They compete in a North American and increasingly global marketplace. I know that. I'm the former Minister of International Trade. I've traveled all around the world. I've seen how Canadians are working hard to try to compete within a global marketplace. The Liberals are undermining that effort. Liberal tax and economic policies are chasing away investors and undermining our competitive advantage in the North American marketplace. And the election of President Trump has really thrown a spanner into the works. The new president has announced that he is reducing the U.S. corporate tax rate from 35% down to 15%, and re-energizing the coal industry to deliver cheaper electricity to manufacturers. In Canada, we're going the opposite direction, increasing taxes on our businesses and foisting astronomically expensive electricity costs on our job creators in places like Ontario. Now, Kevin Libin, writing in the National Post last week, commented that, quote, as our G7 competitors have trimmed away at corporate tax rates, Canada's average rates only grew, moving us from one of the most attractive to one of the least attractive in just a few years. Trump's tax plan will make us look much, much worse, he said. That's disgraceful, Mr. Speaker. to take a country that was a leader in competitiveness when it comes to taxes and losing that competitive advantage. Mr. Speaker, this does not end well. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce implored the federal government to reduce business costs and improve Canada's economic competitiveness. In fact, CEO Perrin Beatty had this to say: "Investment crosses borders like light through glass. If we continue to allow a growing gap between what it costs to do business in Canada and the costs our competitors face, businesses will be forced to locate their activities elsewhere." End quote. Let me repeat. They will locate their activities elsewhere. One organization that reached out to my office is the recently formed Ontario Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers. They include the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Baking Association, Food and Beverage Ontario, and a host of mostly mid-sized manufacturers across this province of Ontario. Their founder, Jocelyn Bamford, had this to say about the direction of the federal government. Quote, "We're standing on a beach with a tidal wave called cap and trade barreling down at us, and our government still doesn't realize that this tsunami will destroy manufacturing and small businesses in Ontario." End quote. She goes on to say that, quote, "Businesses are terrified of what the federal government is doing. The government is supposed to help us, but its policies are causing us to consider moving our growth to other jurisdictions." End quote. Let me repeat. Moving our growth to other jurisdictions. That means to other countries. In the last 10 years, her company has experienced more than a doubling of its energy costs, undermining her company's ability to do business. In her words, and I quote, "We don't worry about our competition anymore. We fear the government." That's the Liberal government they're talking about. For so many manufacturers across Canada, the high costs of energy and the impact of carbon taxes are enough for them to look south to more favourable jurisdictions in which to do business and grow. That is shocking. Mr. Speaker, what the Prime Minister is doing is to dramatically tilt the playing field against Canadians. This is about competitiveness and about the ability of our businesses to compete on a level playing field within North America and within the global marketplace. And the Liberal government is failing on every account. So, is the Prime Minister listening? Mr. Speaker, Canadian businesses can't afford reckless policies that drive capital and small businesses out of our country. Will the government reverse its decision to impose a massive carbon tax on Canadians? Will the Prime Minister fulfill his election promise to reduce taxes on our small businesses? Hard-working middle-class Canadians and their families, and don't forget those working hard to join it, are also suffering.
That's right.
The Liberals have piled on by raising taxes on everything from public transit to Uber to beer and wine sales, and they're even taking away the children's fitness tax credit.
Why do they hate you?
Unbelievable.
Why do they hate you?
Not only that, the Prime Minister is significantly increasing the fees that Canadians pay for a wide variety of federal services, including things such as campsites. Can you imagine that?
I don't think that's enough.
Fishing licenses, imagine that. We want to take our grandchildren out to go fishing, and they're jacking up the fees on that to make it less likely Canadian families get a chance to go fishing. They're also jacking up fees on passport applications. Can you believe that? And here's another little dirty Liberal secret. Remember the massive carbon tax that the Prime Minister wants to force Canadians to pay? Well, he's also planning to have you pay GST on that carbon tax.
Tax grab.
You heard that right. The Liberals want you to pay tax on tax.
How much?
In fact, it's already happening in BC, where we're being charged a federal GST on the amount of carbon tax being charged by the provincial government. It is insanity, Mr. Speaker. The bottom line, the government is nickel and diming Canadians to death to pay for the Prime Minister's out-of-control spending on his own vanity projects. Projects like the $2.65 billion he spent on environmental projects outside of our country when the money could and should have stayed in Canada. There's a whole host of these. And is there any Canadian supervision over how that money gets spent? I've asked about it, and they say very little supervision, very little monitoring to make sure those billions of dollars being spent abroad actually do what they were intended to do. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have failed Canadians miserably. They've saddled us with more debt, more deficits, more taxes than at any other time in our history. And I repeat, this will not end well for us and for our future generations. So is the Prime Minister listening?
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the member across the way has demonstrated that, and quite well, that the Conservative Party really and truly has lost touch with Canadians. They're in fact not even listening to what Canadians want. You know, the member across the way says, you know, tax, deficit, and debt. Well, Madam Speaker, when this government, when the Minister of Finance came up with the largest decrease in income tax for Canada's middle class, 9 million Canadians benefit, hundreds of millions of dollars put in the pockets of Canadians, what did the Conservative Party do? They voted against it, Mr. Speaker. When it comes across to deficit, we can never achieve, I would think in this very short time frame, the amount of debt in which Stephen Harper had achieved, over $150 billion. We don't need to take a lesson from the Conservatives on the deficit. But when listening to Canadians, and my question to the member is, would he not agree that Canadians want this government to invest in Canada's infrastructure? And that is one of the things in which I would suggest the Conservative Party needs to rethink and vote in favour of Canada's infrastructure program.
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Man, that is really funny, Mr. Speaker. This is a government that promised they were going to invest $120 billion in infrastructure. You remember that promise? You know what they did in their budget? They pushed virtually all of that spending off 10 years to the end of the 10-year cycle. You know why? Because they really don't want to spend that money. When we were in government, every single penny we promised to spend on infrastructure was spent on critical infrastructure, including our gateways, the Asia-Pacific Gateway. We're talking about the continental gateways, the inland ports. We invested heavily to make sure that Canada maintained its effectiveness. You know what the Liberals are doing? They're investing in make-work projects, and they've pushed off all of their infrastructure spending commitments 10 years down the road so they won't have to live by them. I mean, it's shameful, this record. All Canadians have to do is check this budget and check what they're spending on infrastructure. It's there, boldly standing out as a failed policy of the Liberal government.
Broken promise.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Salaberry-Surrey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. He talked about competitiveness for businesses in the economy. We don't always agree on this subject, but we've seen that recently the Liberals in their budget increased the excise tax on wine and winemakers by 2%. That's going to affect the competitiveness of our wineries. And that opens the door under our free trade agreements to more wine coming in from outside. Our winemakers are saying that this is unfair to them and that they're going to be losing a fair bit of money. So I wonder if my colleague feels that the Liberals should be doing a better job of protecting our winemakers and taking away this tax increase, that it's an error to add this tax.
Member for Abbotsford.
Well, the simple answer, Mr. Speaker, is no. We as Canadians, we believe in fair competition, we believe in free trade, and I would remind the member that back when the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was being negotiated, you remember that? Remember how our wine growers were saying, this is the end of our industry because you're not going to protect us against California wine anymore. It is over for our industry. Well, you know what happened? The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and then NAFTA, they came into force. And our wine industry was forced to adapt and get better and invest in itself. Today, our wine industry is a world leader. And you know how I know that, Mr. Speaker? This past weekend, I was in the Okanagan Valley doing wine tasting, going to the different wineries. Researching. Yes, that's what I was doing, Mr. Speaker. It was great research to do. But I can tell you, the quality of our Canadian wines is the best in the world. That's what we as Canadians do when we can compete fairly.
Resuming debate.